"It's a monster," Eric said eerily. They were all gathered around Dave's living room listening to the stereo, and Eric was telling them about the Austin Bayou monster. It lives back on the Austin Bayou between Highway 2004 and Danbury, in the thick woods that separate the bayou from the rice fields. It's a secluded place that it calls home, because the only time anyone ever goes out there between planting and harvest is to clean the irrigation ditches. It doesn't worry about leaving footprints, because the rice fields are always flooding, and who could see them? I knew an old boy once, way back when I was just a little thing, who told me about the monster. I was over at his house picking oranges from the trees in his backyard, and I had occasion to see him when he was wearing short pants. I never knew he had a fake leg until that day, and I asked him what happened to his leg. He said that one day he was hunting down on the bayou a ways where the trees were real thick with Spanish moss that was so heavy you couldn't see the sun through it. He'd seen a deer go into the woods and figured if he was real quiet, he could sneak up on it and catch it bedding down. So he eased his way along the bank of the bayou until he came to the thicket and pushed his way quietly through the Spanish moss. It was real quiet in there, and hardly any light came through, which made it look like early morning just before the sun comes up. He figured he understood why that deer went in there, and he stalked from tree to tree without making a sound. He hadn't gone far when he heard a noise off to one side and went to investigate. He stopped by a tree to look around, and he heard a noise above him. He looks up in that tree to see what made that noise, and what he saw scared him so bad he dropped his gun and took off. He hadn't got far when he realized he was turned around and couldn't find his way out, so he stopped to see if he could tell where the sun was. Looking up in the trees didn't do no good because the moss was so thick, and he figured the only way he was going to tell anything would be to get real low to the ground and look through the trees. By doing this, he could see where the light came in under the moss the brightest, and that would be the way to one of the outer edges of the thicket. He got down real low and started looking all around when something jumped on his back, picked him up, and threw him to the ground. When he woke up, he was in a tree over the water of the bayou, and his leg hurt real bad. When he looked to see just why his leg was hurt, he saw it wasn't there no more, just shreds of skin and a jagged piece of bone sticking out of it. He looked around and saw he was over the water and knew that he was dealing with one smart critter. The blood was dripping from his leg, and he figured the critter knew that if the blood pooled on the ground, it would give away the location of its kill. So it put him over water, where the blood would fade into the water and flow away with the current. Sizing up the situation, he decided he better get a move on if he was going to get out of there, because there was no telling when the monster would come back to finish eating him. As quiet as he could, he slipped down into the tree and into the water, figuring if nothing could find him over the water, then the monster shouldn't be able to find him in the water. His leg hurt too much to try and swim, so he rolled a log off the bank and floated downstream toward where he parked his truck. When he'd floated clear of the thicket where he could see the highway, he heard a sickening growl behind him and turned to see. Just inside the moss, where he couldn't make out much, it looked like somebody standing there, but instead of a normal human head, it had the head of an alligator. He said that if you go down to Austin Bayou on a hot summer night and listen, you can hear the monster howling in rage into the night to protest its hideous form. Some say the devil caught up with an alligator poacher and turned him into a half-man, half-gator. Eric sat back on the couch as if exhausted from telling the story, sipping on his soda and looking around the room. "Not bad, Eric. I knew you could come up with a good story if you tried." Kevin held his glass up. "What story?" Eric stated. "That was a true story told to me by old T-Bone himself." Jeff laughed and Dave said, "Yeah, right, just like the dinosaur steaks in my freezer. If you want to hear a true thing, then listen up, and I'll tell you about Lechook. Lechook is a great white owl spirit who guides the souls of my people, the Mexicans, to heaven after they die. Sometimes when you're driving down the road at night, if you look out the window to the side, you can see Lechook flying alongside the car like he's watching you. He doesn't mean any harm if you see him this way. He's just letting you know that he's ready to guide you if you need him. Legend says that when one of your family or friends dies, you must take an article of their clothing and go to a deserted crossroads the first night that there is no moon after they die. At exactly midnight, you must face north and whistle once, as long and hard as you can. Then you face south, east, and finally west, doing this each time. Then you lay the piece of clothing in the center of the crossroads and walk backward to your car or horse or whatever you came in. And once you get there, you must turn away and not look back or travel through the crossroads after this until the next sunrise. The reason for the clothing is to let Lechook know who he is to guide, and the whistling is to call him. You have to look at the crossroads as you leave so that when Lechook comes, he knows where to find the marker. My cousin told me this legend, and when I laughed, he said that he had also laughed until one night he and his best friend went out to the crossroads on a night with no moon. They'd been drinking tequila and having a good time, and he told his friend about Lechook. His friend had laughed too, and gave him his shirt and said, "Go call this snowy owl." So my cousin, thinking it was all a joke, performed the ceremony and they left together. He dropped his friend off at home that night and he went home. The next day they were supposed to meet to do something and his friend didn't show up, so he went to his house, thinking he had drank too much tequila and was still sleeping. When he got there, he found the window by his friend's bed broken and a white feather on the pillow. He never saw him again. Dave looked at Eric and said, "That is true, and I believe it. My cousin looked scared when he told me that story." "Yeah, he was scared you were going to see him lying," Eric said and started to laugh. Dave jumped up off his chair and Kevin could tell he was mad because he started to interject Spanish as he spoke. "Hey, vato, you calling me primo a liar?" He started toward Eric and Kevin jumped up. "Come on, Dave, he's just joking." Kevin held him back. Eric doesn't go much for legends and tradition. Dave relaxed and sat back down. "Thanks, Essie. I was almost going to kick his ass." "Hey, Dave, I'm really sorry, man. I didn't mean to say your cousin was a liar." Eric hadn't realized how serious Dave was. "No problem, dude. Just remember it." Dave went to the kitchen to get a bag of chips. He offered them around, starting with Eric. No one said anything more about the story, and it seemed the thought and interest in telling stories had passed. Making excuses, Eric went out the door and into the night, leaving the three of them alone to finish the evening. "When do you guys get out of school for the summer?" Dave asked as he settled into a big chair. "At the end of this week, thank God." Kevin was ready for summer break and a break from the studies. "Eric ticked me off with that stuff he was saying about Lechook," Dave started. "You guys want to help me teach him a lesson?" Kevin remembered how mad Dave had gotten and wondered just what type of lesson he meant. "What do you got in mind?" Dave looked at Jeff and back. "I don't want to hurt him, but I do want to scare him." Jeff spoke up. "I've been friends with Eric for a long time, and I ain't gonna do nothing that even seems like violence." "No, nothing like that." Dave laid out his plan, and they listened with growing interest. The last day of school was finally over, and Kevin was looking forward to the coming night. Tonight, Dave was going to show them that Lechook was real. Eric had agreed, but still mocked the old legend, saying that no owl would come. In his belief of Lechook, Dave made it clear to Kevin and Jeff that he would not use anyone's clothing when they called the bird. Instead, they would take an old shirt that his dog slept on. In order for the plan to work, Eric needed to think it was Jeff's shirt, and Jeff would quietly disappear for the next day to scare Eric. Then the next evening he would reappear and all would have a good laugh. The time had come to call Lechook. They drove out to a lonely crossroads and Jeff was wearing the dog's shirt. The night was clear and dark, with no sign of the moon. A perfect night for Lechook. They parked at the crossroads just before midnight and stood by the car. "Eric, let me have your shirt," Dave demanded. "No way, man. This is a nice shirt, and I'm not going to let you leave it in the middle of the road. Ask somebody else." He backed away. "Kevin, let me have your shirt," Dave asked again and had to fight to keep from laughing. "No way, Dave. I believe in Lechook, and I'm not done living yet." He wrapped his arms around himself in defiance. Finally, Dave turned to Jeff, who was wearing the shirt the dog slept on. "Okay, will you give me your shirt?" Jeff gave them a mocking smile and handed over the shirt. It was midnight, and Dave walked to the center of the crossroads and began to whistle. When he was done, he laid the shirt neatly on the road and backed away slowly. When he got back to the car, they started to climb in and heard a loud screeching noise. They looked in the direction of the noise, and there on a fence post was a large screech owl. Dave started the motor as Eric stared open-mouthed at the bird, and they drove back to the bayou. "See, I told you it was real," Dave said with a grin. None of them had expected to actually see an owl, but it was a major point in their favor. On the way home, they all agreed to meet at Jeff's the next morning. Jeff had gotten permission from his dad to use the boat so they could go water skiing. Dave dropped them off at each house as he went by and went on home. After he was sure the others were in their houses, Jeff went behind his and waited across the canal. His mom was waiting on the other side to take him to her house until the next evening when she would bring him to Dave's. She laughed when he told her about the appearance of the owl and how Eric had reacted. The next morning, Kevin was waiting for Eric to come by so they could walk to Jeff's together. Eric came out of his house and looked around before he started up the road. Kevin wondered what he was looking for but didn't say anything. "How hard is it to water ski?" Kevin asked Eric as he walked up. They could see Dave coming from the other direction. "I've never skied before." "Oh, it's not hard at all. Just remember to hang on and you'll learn fast. I'm going to go first so you can watch me." Eric looked up and waved to Dave. They all arrived at Jeff's driveway at the same time and walked up to the door. Dave gave Kevin a knowing wink and walked ahead of them to knock on the door. "Morning, boys." It was Jeff's dad. "Have you guys seen Jeff? When I got up to give him the keys to the boat, I went to wake him up, and all I found in his bed were these." He held up a couple of white feathers. If Eric had looked at them instead of just the color, he would have realized they were just chicken feathers from a pillow and not the large, fluffy feathers of an owl. "Oh, man, Lechook got him," Eric moaned and started to back away. "He was supposed to meet us here," Dave said. "If you see him, tell him we'll be waiting by my house. He can just pull up to the boat dock over there." "Oh, okay. Sorry you boys are disappointed." His dad went back into the house. Dave led them away as fast as he could. Eric was busy moaning about his best friend, but he and Kevin had heard the laughter coming from in the house. It wouldn't do to have the gag blown, not after all that work. Evening came and they were all lying around Dave's living room watching karate movies. They had been there all day, and it had been hard for Kevin and Dave to remain serious. Occasionally they looked over at Eric, who was not really watching the TV and feeling bad, and smiled at each other. The gag was going great. The night grew later, and Dave called Kevin aside. "Where is Jeff? He was supposed to be here by now." "I know. Maybe he's trying to make the joke better and get us too," Kevin smiled. It was what he would do. "Yeah, you're right. You feel like drinking some beers?" Dave looked at him to see his reaction. Kevin was getting anxious about Jeff, so he agreed. "Yeah, but only a couple, and I'm going to go easy this time." They gathered Eric and got into Dave's car to go to town for some beer. Jeff was not there when they got back, so they figured they could play this game, and ignored it. Kevin awoke to the sun in his face. He was still at Dave's, and he looked around the room at Dave and Eric still sleeping in various uncomfortable positions. Quietly, he got up and went out to sit on the deck. He just finished his first smoke and was lighting another when Dave came out. "I wonder what happened to Jeff," he mumbled as he rubbed his eyes. "A joke's a joke, but he didn't have to go and blow it." "Hey, Dave, you don't think maybe his scent roughed off on that shirt and the owl really got him, do you?" Kevin looked out over the water. He wrote stories, and now it seemed like he might be trapped in one. "No, that stuff about Lechook is bull. I just made it up to see how Eric would react," he smiled. "I figured Jeff is just playing it up to scare everybody. He didn't know I made it up." Kevin looked at him curiously. If he made it up, then why did he get so upset with Eric that night? He had still been mad when Eric left, and that's what started this whole mess. "Come on," Dave said as he headed down the stairs. "You can help me wash the Charger." They walked around the house to the carport, and when they came around the corner, Dave stopped and was staring at the dog's food bowl. "What's the matter, Dave?" Kevin looked at the bowl, and there was nothing out of the ordinary. "I just noticed that bowl is full. I feed the dog every morning, and his bowl is always empty." He passed it off and started to wash the car. Kevin watched the wax dry into a thin white film of swirls over the car's body. He had rubbed it in on a heavy circular motion as a green paste, and in no time it was white. "Where does the color go?" he thought to himself as he worked. With the last of the wax rubbed off the paint, Dave went into the garage and came back out with a couple of old toothbrushes. "What are you going to do with those?" Kevin asked as he was handed one. Eric came around the house and looked at them working on the car. "What are you guys doing?" The answer was obvious, but Kevin realized that he and Dave were working on his car while Eric was still concerned about Jeff. He decided he wasn't going to play Jeff's game and tossed his toothbrush to Eric. "Waiting around ain't going to make him come back. Come on and help." He grabbed a rag and listened as Dave explained to Eric how to use the toothbrush to clean the wax from the cracks in the chrome and other places a rag couldn't reach. When the car was finished, they piled in and headed for the beach, where they could look at girls and enjoy the sun. The beach was crowded now that school was out, and people had come down from Dallas and Houston to use their beach houses. Kevin marveled at the miles of sand and oiled female flesh. They hadn't been there for long when Eric spotted a girl he liked and went after her. Kevin and Dave sat back and listened as Eric turned on an Australian accent and went walking away with his arm around her. "I guess they ain't too worried about Jeff anymore," Kevin said, and they both laughed. "He's dead." Dave was almost crying and took another long pull from his beer. "I know I told you that stuff with Lechook was all made up, but I just said that so you wouldn't worry and blow the joke." Dave finished the beer and grabbed another one. They were cruising down a dark country road, and Kevin was driving because Dave was too drunk. He'd never seen Dave like this before, and he was afraid of what might happen. It was Friday night again, and they hadn't seen Jeff since they dropped him off last Friday night at his house. Eric had gone to see his grandmother in Abilene on Wednesday with his spirits really low. He was already convinced that the bird had taken Jeff and was trying to cope with his grief. "And I'll tell you another thing." Dave was getting hard to understand. "That damn owl also took my dog." Kevin looked over at him and saw he was serious. "Remember when I showed you this food bowl was full? Well, I haven't filled it since, and the food is still there." Dave lit a cigarette and dropped it. "Pull over, I can't find my smoke." They pulled under a tree on the side of the road, and Kevin went to relieve himself while David found his cigarette. When he came back, Dave was laying on the hood of the car on his back, looking up at the sky. "Kevin, you might want to be careful about what you write." He sat up and looked at him. "I never thought that Lechook would take someone that was still alive, so the joke was okay. But now that Jeff is gone, I can see that it's never okay to mess with stuff you don't understand. You know what I mean?" Kevin looked at Dave, trying to understand what he meant. He himself was not sure what had happened to Jeff, but he had never given up hope, as Eric and Dave had done. There was always a rational explanation to things that happened. Dave began to laugh hysterically, and Kevin watched him get into the car and grab another beer. He got behind the wheel and continued to drive in silence. Kevin was thinking of the events of this summer's beginning and wondered if all his summers would hold adventures like the last few had. This thing with Jeff was not good, but it had opened up ideas in his mind for more subjects to write about. He was thinking hard about this when Dave spoke again. "I'm scared," Dave said, and Kevin waited to hear what he was scared of. Kevin looked over at Dave, and he was sleeping. He began to wonder just what his friend was scared of and headed back to Dave's house. He had just come through the crossroads when he saw something out of the corner of his eye. He turned to look, and there was a great white owl flying along with the car just off the road. He looked at the owl and watched as it spiraled up into the night. David said that this was not bad, but he couldn't help but shudder. They pulled up at Dave's, and Kevin helped him into the house. He left the car keys on the counter and a note saying he'd see Dave the next day, and then left. When Kevin got to Dave's the next evening, Eric was already there. He trudged up the steps and plopped down on the deck in a tired heap. "What's the matter, Kevin?" Eric asked, seeing how tired he was. "You been working out in the shrimp boat and catch a bunch?" "No. I worked for Mr. Waters today drilling water wells." Kevin was so tired he could barely talk and wondered why he wasn't at home sleeping. "That is hard work." Eric laughed. "Yeah, I know. I worked for him too last summer, and never again." Dave looked at them and snorted. "When I was your age, I was pouring concrete. A lot of times before we poured, I had to dig out the pools by hand and then carry the dirt out in a wheelbarrow with one hand." Eric and Kevin burst into laughter. "And I suppose you used to walk to school in several feet of snow uphill both ways, too," Kevin laughed. The sun finally set on the bayou, bringing the refreshing cool air of night to them. Dave broke out several bottles of beer. They were all laughing when a new voice rose behind them. "Hey, you guys, what's going on?" It was Jeff. Eric ran up and wrapped his arms around him in a bear hug. "Where have you been, man? I thought you were dead." Jeff was confused. Apparently, he had forgotten about the joke. Kevin told him about what happened during the past week and then looked at him in a very serious way. "So where were you all week? You were supposed to show up Saturday to let Eric off the hook." Jeff looked at Eric. "You mean you actually believe that mess about giant owls?" He laughed. "I'm sorry. After you guys dropped me off, I crossed the canal and my mom picked me up and we went to her place, just like we planned. Saturday, my grandfather came down from Dallas and asked if I wanted to go spend the week with him. So I did. I just got back a little while ago." "You mean this was all a joke?" Eric was looking at Dave and Kevin. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because when Jeff never showed up, we figured there might be something to that old story and didn't want you mad at us on top of feeling bad about Jeff," Kevin paused. "Besides, you didn't seem too worried about it at the beach," Kevin said with a fake Australian accent. They all laughed about the joke, and when everyone quieted down, Dave turned to Jeff. "So I suppose you took my dog with you to try to make the gag better too?" He was smiling. "Your dog? What do you mean, I took your dog? I never took your dog. Where is he?" He began to call the dog. "He's been missing since last Friday night when we called the owl."